All right, let's take a look at this data that I put together. So I pulled down, I don't know, around 130,000 profiles, LinkedIn profiles for talent sourcers. Now, this is people that have sourcing titles or like talent acquisition recruiter or something like that with sourcing keywords. I'll have a full walkthrough of how I came to identify these people, but I think the data is probably more interesting to just look at. But I pretty confident that I captured most of the people that would think of themselves as primarily sourcers or like doing a lot of heavy sourcing work in this list. And of that it was actually 129,100 people, about half were actually doing sourcing work and were not in procurement or something. So I think the number for that identified that were actually doing sourcing work was 67,900 people. From there, I wanted to know, all right, who are the people that are really true sourcers, not people who have a sourcer title, but we're really doing like entry-level recruiting type work, because a lot of companies will call their entry-level recruiters sourcers. I mean, I've worked for a company like that in the past. And to me, that's not as relevant as what I'm trying to look at here. I mean, it might be interesting information to look at in its own right, but different from what I'm trying to identify here. And so if I segment that down to those people, which again, I'll kind of walk through my logic in that at a later date. But that subset of people who are doing true sourcing work is around 26,000 people. So over 100,000 people that I pulled were not relevant. And from there, I then flattened out all the jobs, assigned IDs, and then actually flattened out all of that information by month for every month that person had the job, so that I could count it here and look at the total job saturation. So here's what we have here. So this is the landing page for quickly.io right now. This used to be an old tool that I have not maintained for years. As soon this will be my new website where the Quickly Chrome extension will be available, where you can get that and some other tools as well as this information. But for right now, the landing page is just this data set. So let's take a look. When you first land here, it has the minimum set here for 200 and max at basically the maximum job peak +5, I think. Yeah. So you can change that, right? So if you just want to look at the top, which is US here, or if you want to look at maybe the mid-tier saturations, so this is by country, right? You can just kind of adjust this slider here. So this is the max peak. And by max peak, that means that most amount of jobs that were ever in the history of that country that were in sourcing. So let's go down to a minimum of 75 with a max. That's actually good, right? So you can see all these countries here. You can zoom in like so. This is using HighCharts, which is a pretty cool service. I normally don't use libraries, but I didn't have a lot of time. Sorry, I just realized the sliders were at the top of the screen, so you can see them here now. I didn't really have time to build my own graphical interface for these charts, so I used an API for once, and I'm pretty happy with this. I played around with D3 as well as Chart.js. This is just what I use today. But yeah, it allows you can just kind of zoom in here to get a closer view, and then you can move this into full screen if you want to see the full, get a full picture here. One thing that I did notice that you might find interesting as well, I don't know that it really means anything, but as I was poking around here, just looking at different countries, I noticed that New Zealand and Malaysia have an interesting relationship. And I don't know if it means anything, but this jumps out to me that there's trading talent going on. Maybe it could be a coincidence, but you notice and it's not all the time, but like here in 2011, New Zealand peaks up, Malaysia peaks down. Now they both peak up here in 2012, but you'll then see New Zealand peaks up at the beginning of 2012 and Malaysia peaks down. And here, right, there's a peak down for Malaysia as they're going through some growth, not as dramatic. And here Malaysia overtakes New Zealand, while New Zealand is flat and actually going down for a minute. And it's more or less the same here, but then there's a major peak up here in 2019 in the summer, and a pretty significant peak down in Malaysia in that same summer of 2019, and really all the way through to 2020, and then everybody drops off in 2020. Obviously, we know why that is. But yeah, you can just kind of get a view on that sort of thing. At some point here, I will be adding other kind of segmenting options. I'm thinking I'm going to add like a selector for by continent, so that you can say, all right, just show me all the countries in Europe or in North America or in the Americas, right? And this data does not include leadership roles, so I pulled out leadership jobs and some other things that you can kind of filter on that I might add back. Like, for example, in this set also, I removed any jobs that don't have a company that is tied to a LinkedIn ID, right? So when you're on a LinkedIn profile, you'll see people have entered in a company that's like free floating. There's no actual company page. I removed those. It's not a significant amount of people anyway, but it's enough that I just was worried about it corrupting my data. So I just went ahead and removed those jobs. But I could add the option to add them back. It's not a big deal to do that. And I'm also going to, at some point, probably not for a month or so, map the companies that employ sourcers over time and look at the saturation of where talent sourcers are working. We could do a lot of stuff like that. You could look at what those companies do, not just industry, but I have like the company description. So, you could even, maybe write keywords on companies and say, all right, I want to look for, I don't know, companies that are in green tech, and I want to see what their sourcers are doing, or how many sourcers are there and where that trend happened. I also I've tagged these data. So the baseline is sourcers here, but like maybe you wanted to look at the people who are doing diversity sourcing and how that trend happens over time. So I'll probably be adding that sort of thing. But if you had any ideas around it, or if any of those things that I mentioned are things that you'd like, drop a comment, maybe mention it. I'll be more likely to do it. And again, here's kind of where you can edit things for now. If you want to just see everything, you can do the min, do the max, and then just remove the countries that you don't want to see. See if there's anything interesting here with kind of the countries that have a lower saturation jobs. So again, to get into like the full view, click the little hamburger menu up here and just hit full screen. It makes it a little bit easier to view here. This is just kind of out of box HighCharts service. I normally don't use other people's services, but like I just didn't have time to build my own. So I'm using this, and it's pretty cool. But there's a few things that out of the box are not ideal, like the size of the chart. Oh, so we're talking about how I arrived at the country. So this was an interesting project for identifying locations. So now I have a lot of tools that I've made for this project that I can utilize elsewhere. I had some existing tools for the United States, but I didn't really have any global tools for location data. And this stuff isn't perfect, but it's pretty good, especially for this LinkedIn data. So oftentimes you'll have people living in a country, but working a job that's in another country, right? And so is that job, are they actually in that country, or they just have that on their profile? How do we know this? There's not a great way to know that, as well as the job location data is free floating text. So it's not, it doesn't follow any kind of standard. A lot of it does hit a standard, but a lot of it is just like you could not even put a location in there, right? Like you could just put some other information, which people do. And so figuring out, like normalizing that data, as well as figuring out where to actually set that job like as the location that's listed versus their profile location, was a bit of a learning exercise. And so the way I did it was, first I have something that normalizes all the country names, right? So it splits out, it identifies if there is a country in there and extracts it. Then I look at the job location versus the profile location. And I've got a map of a chart or list, index, whatever you want to call it, of all the countries with their GDP per capita. And I thought, chances are if you are living in a country where your GDP is lower than the country that your job location is listed in, you're probably actually still living and working in the country that your profile information is listed at. And so basically I would do an if condition that, all right, if these two things are different, choose the one with the lower GDP, as well as if there was no other location data, right? So there's no job location, there's no profile location, there's nothing. If the company was faceted, meaning like it had an ID tied to LinkedIn, well, that company does have a headquarters location that is always listed, always. And so I mapped all those country locations. And so if no other information was available, then I mapped that job to the company headquarters location. So, the data is not perfect, but I feel like it's about as good as you're going to get with what we're working with. So anyway, feel free to play around with it. I'll have this as like the main landing page for at least another week before I push it to a back page. But in any case, it'll still be housed in the, on Quickly, just probably in a back page for like, I don't know, it'll be in tools or research. I'll probably have a research tab since I have this, I guess. But anyway, have fun with this. If you appreciate this work, you can support my Patreon. I do have a PayPal set up as well that I'll have linked on my website here when I post the rest of my build that I'm working on here. So you can support me that way, or you can just like and comment this video so that other people are exposed to some of my work. Unless you don't like this, then hit the thumbs down and tell me why this is garbage or whatever. I welcome feedback. And again, like I said, if you have any insights that you would want to pull out of this information, leave a comment or shoot me an email.